You're listening to the Mind Over Murder podcast.
My name is Bill Thomas. I'm a writer, consulting producer, and now podcaster. I am now trying to use my experience as the brother of a murder victim to help other victims of violent crime. I'm working on a book on the unsolved Colonial Parkway murders, and I'm the co-administrator of the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook group together with Kristin Dilley.
My name is Kristin Dilley. I'm a writer, a researcher, a teacher, and a victims advocate, as well as the social media manager and co-administrator for the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook page with my partner in crime, Bill Thomas. This episode contains discussions of sexual assault and rape, which may be disturbing to some listeners. Listener discretion is advised. Welcome to Mind Over Murder. I'm Kristin Dilley.
And I'm Bill Thomas.
We're joined today by journalist and author Nicki Egan to talk to us about the developments in the Bill Cosby case. Nicki, thank you so much for joining us on Mind Over Murder.
Thanks for having me on.
Nicki, fill our listeners in on your personal and professional background, especially as it relates to how you began reporting on Bill Cosby.
I have been a journalist for almost 30 years. Scary to say. Back in 2005, I was a crime investigative writer at the Philadelphia Daily News. And my boss pretty much assigned me the big breaking crime stories, and I would dig into them and try to get us ahead on them. So one day in January 2005, it broke on the news that Bill Cosby was being investigated for drugging and this was the initial report, groping a former Temple University employee. And of course, Bill Cosby is a native of Philadelphia. He's the most famous alum of Temple University, even though he never graduated from there. He just got an honorary degree later on. He did attend for a few years and just beloved. And I was a huge fan myself. I grew up watching Fat Albert and the Cosby Kids on Saturday morning cartoons with my brother. I watched The Cosby Show. It kind of got me out of all the chaos and all the grief in my own home after my older brother died when I was 16 years old. I loved that show. I thought Bill Cosby was Cliff Huxtable. And I was even sort of excited when I moved to Philly because I just loved him. I thought, maybe I'll end up doing a story about him or meeting him sometime. I didn't think it would be this story. And I had just done a big expose on drug-facilitated sexual assault being on the rise in Philly like a year or two before. What I found was truly horrifying because it is the perfect crime. These drugs take away a victim's memory. They take away their ability to resist. Most of them are gone out of their system within 12 hours. So if they wake up the next day and want to go to the hospital and get tested, the drugs are already gone. Even worse than that, if you go to the police, they could even say you took the drugs voluntarily. And who are they going to believe, you? Or what if the person is someone like Bill Cosby, who you say did this to you, America's dad? Who do you think the police are going to believe? So it was a wake-up call to be about these crimes. I thought they were truly horrific. So to find Bill Cosby, America's dad, being accused of this was horrific. And my job as a journalist is to put my personal feelings aside and try to find out what the truth is and get both sides. And I thought, well, we know who Bill Cosby is, or at least who we think he is. Who is this woman accusing him? Because, of course, they weren't naming her, which is common with sexual assault cases. News organizations don't name a sexual assault victim without their consent, although that would quickly change with this case, although not with my stories. But I found out through a source at Temple who she was. I had her name, and I was able to do a Nexus search on her and found out she was one of the top 10 high school basketball players in Canada. She got recruited by 40 to 50 colleges in the U.S. and ultimately went to the University of Arizona on scholarship. She dreamed of playing for the WNBA one day. When that didn't happen, she went to Italy and played professionally for 18 months. And then she ended up back in Canada and was sort of trying to figure out what to do next because it was clear she was never going to play professional basketball. Then Dawn Staley, who was the Temple women's basketball coach at the time and a close friend of Cosby's, came to her through a friend and asked her if she wanted to be director of operations for the women's basketball team. That's how she met Cosby. Andrea took the job, she got there, and 8 or 10 months later, she was at a home basketball game and Cosby was there and a donor introduced them. Now, Cosby was also very close to Dawn Staley, as I said. There was a poster there are pictures of the two of them on the walls at her office, and he devoted the Philadelphia premiere of the Fat Albert movie to Dawn Staley. So there was that aspect to it. Plus, Cosby was on the board of trustees at Temple University, basically Andrea's boss. And he followed up with the phone. He began calling her at the offices there, asking questions about the women's basketball team. At the time, he was even doing commercials for Comcast, which was local then, not the mammoth it is now, Comcast TV, about the women's basketball team. So he was just all in. I remember he used to wear Temple University sweatshirts or shirts on The Cosby Show. So they struck up a friendship and what she thought was a mentorship. Now, as he later said in his own deposition, he had his eye on her romantically from the very beginning. And it was, if you read some of the stuff I read, he was like a predator versus prey thing. He was just slowly reeling her into his circle and gaining her trust and grooming her. And he did what he did with so many of the other victims. He groomed her family. He met her mom and her sister. When he did a performance in Canada, they had pictures with him. It's like a script he was working from, and it was very well thought out and very well performed. So anyway, that's how I got on it. And I quickly discovered she was very credible and that she had a lot of evidence to support her claims. Then a second woman came forward and said that he had done the same thing to her 30 years ago. She told her story to me exclusively, Tamara Green. She first actually told the DA, the local DA's office was investigating. Then she also told Andrea's lawyers because she had obtained lawyers because she's going up against Bill Cosby. And what had made her, he drugged and assaulted her at his home. She had gone to him for advice because she was going to quit her job at Temple in January 2004. And she wanted advice on how to tell Dawn, and Cosby invited her over. And he had like made moves on her 2 times prior. Now she's gay and he knew she was in a relationship with a woman. And she's like, I'm 6 feet tall. He's 70. He's like 30 years older than her, like 10 years older than her own father. And she's like, if anything happens, I can handle it, because she was a very strong, fit athlete, almost 6 feet tall and very fit. So she really wasn't worried about not being able to handle these situations with him. Like I said, he was on the board of trustees. But that night he said, are you nervous? And he knew she only took holistic medicine. She didn't take prescription drugs or anything. And he was very into holistic medicine, or so he said. So she was very nervous. He said, are you stressed? And she said, yes. And he said, here's 2 herbal pills. It's like herbal medication. And right then within 20 minutes, she started feeling woozy. She started trying to stand up. She couldn't really walk. And they were sitting in his kitchen, and he led her over to a couch in the next room and put her on the couch. And at that point, she's paralyzed. She can't move. She can't speak. And he begins sexually assaulting her as she's in and out of consciousness. And when she woke a few hours later, she was laying on the couch and her clothes were disheveled. And he comes down the stairs. He's standing there in a white bathrobe, and he offers her a muffin and some tea. And she's just going through this whole thing. Oh my God, what just happened? Like, what happened? This is America's dad. You know, this is what happened. And that's what a lot of sexual assault victims go through in these circumstances, because, you know, I think the statistic is 85% of sexual assaults are from someone the victim knows. Only 15% are stranger sexual assaults. So she went home, she took a shower, she was trying to figure out what to do. She did try to confront him a month or 2 later, because she just wanted to know, what drug you gave me? What did you do? And he just said something to her like, well, you had an orgasm. And she just was just, okay, I'm done. She moved back home. She was going to go back to massage school to be a masseuse like her dad back in Canada. She went home and her parents knew something was wrong with her. She came home, she was pale, she was shaking, she didn't eat, she didn't want to socialize. She was having nightmares where she was screaming in her sleep. One morning in January 2005, she woke up from another nightmare, and these dreams apparently were about women being raped in front of her, and it was her fault because she hadn't spoken up. And that's what made her finally call the police, because she was so worried he was going to do this to someone else, and it would be her fault because she had not spoken up. And that's what started this whole thing. But the DA at the time decided not to charge Cosby. And to this day, I mean, that's what ultimately led to his being freed last year, but that's a whole other thing. So anyway, that's a long story. That's how I got on it. And it became like this whole thing. I got interviews with other victims. He had done this too, and so on and so forth. And that's how I got on it. I started out being the biggest fan of Cosby, just trying to do my job as a journalist and set my personal feelings aside. And the more I dug into this and the more I found out about her, the more credible I found her.
How did you deal with having to come to the realization that America's dad, Bill Cosby, is a dangerous predator? How did you deal with that? Especially because you said you were a fan of the show. That's such a level of cognitive dissonance. How do you deal with that?
Well, it was really interesting. My journalism training helped me because I was able to just the facts, ma'am, focus on the facts, focus on presenting both sides. And it wasn't until I started writing my book in the summer of 2018 after his conviction that I really, and I made it from my point of view because it was very difficult to get a book deal on this in general because of who Cosby is. And at that point, this was in 2018, there had been, the other media jumped in 2014 and began very aggressively reporting it. But I was the only one doing it in 2005 and I was attacked by the rest of the media back then. But for that book, I really had to dig into my own personal feelings. My editor would send it back, okay, we need you to really think about this. That's when it really started. And when I wrote the chapter about the sentencing and I was at his sentencing and I saw him after he was sentenced to prison and I saw him starting to roll up his sleeves and he's wearing those red suspenders like Cliff Huxtable used to wear. I found myself feeling sad. I'm like, why am I feeling sad? And I wrote about that in the book because it was just, it was separating, realizing he never was Cliff Huxtable, that this person I thought he was is not who he is. Cliff Huxtable was a fictional character, and Bill Cosby is not Cliff Huxtable.
And he's
Bill
not
Cosby.
America's dad either.
No. I mean, he was, but he used that as a cover, and that helped him gain the trust of these women as well. As I wrote about, I started at my own Substack column last year because I felt like there are things I still wanted to say about this as things evolve, but I don't want to write news stories because I put my opinion out there. So I write opinion pieces when things happen. And with the recent development with Judy Huth in the civil case, and she was a 16-year-old girl, I thought most people don't realize how many of his victims were teenagers.
Right.
Yeah, that's a whole other level I've been trying to sort out my feelings about, or at least lay out there for other people to see, because I still think he has so many fans that don't want to believe this and don't believe this and truly believe he's innocent.
Well, based on your own research and reporting, Nicki, how many women do you think Bill Cosby has assaulted?
There are 65 known victims. I say known because for every one of them, I think there's at least 10 more, if not 100 more. There are other women who will tell you that they know of other women, some of the victims. I think you'll look at one of these years when a lot of the teenagers happened. It was like all in one year in 1975. So the victim state, the earliest known one is 1965. She was a 17-year-old virgin. And the most recent one that we know about, I believe, is 2008, which I think was Chloe Goines. And there are so many that have never come forward. I believe that. And as I hypothesize in the book, or I say without saying in the book, like how many didn't survive being drugged and sexually assaulted by Bill Cosby? Because how do you know when you drug someone without their knowledge or consent that they're not allergic to the drug? I didn't know I was allergic to Demerol until I got bitten by my parents' dog. I had hand surgery and they gave me Demerol and I broke out in hives all over my body. And had they not given me the antidote, I would have died. So a couple of the women have talked about trying to drive after he drugged them, and some of them dinged other cars. And how many women did not survive that drive home? And it's very easy for someone with a lot of power like him to cover that up. And had Andrea Constand not gone to the police, he had a pattern. Once Andrea went to the police, then he came to her and offered her a scholarship for her massage school. But how many women got scholarships when they dropped their police complaints or didn't go to the police, or just didn't go to the police because he gave them a scholarship, quote unquote. I say scholarship, quote unquote. There's no way of telling how many there are, but I am confident there are many, many, many more.
You know, we do pride ourselves on being a victim-centric podcast, so it is important to us to get out the stories of the victims, which is why we really like all the coverage that you've done on Cosby. And so we believe Andrea Constand and all the other women. Why do you think it is that there are still people who just don't believe it? I was reading through your book and I was appalled at the number of people who jumped to Cosby's defense, both well-known and people who would still show up and go to his shows and offer him standing ovations. Why are there still people out there who just don't want to believe that Bill Cosby was living like this wholly different existence from the Daddy Huxtable image on TV?
Because these are people, first of all, America's a celebrity worshiping country. We worship our celebrities here. I guarantee you all of the people who are supporting him have never met him or probably 99% of them. I mean, he's got 500,000 followers on his Facebook page. They grew up with him. They saw him on TV. They don't want to believe it. I mean, it's very different than a Harvey Weinstein or a Jeffrey Epstein, because most people never heard of either of those two people before those scandals broke. But Bill Cosby was a beloved international icon. People thought they knew him. They are just reluctant to let go of that image they have of him. It's ridiculous if you think about it, because he's a celebrity. Just because you play a nice guy on TV doesn't mean you are one. He's an actor. He's a brilliant actor if you gauge his acts of monstrosity against the way he portrays himself on television. I think that's a big part of it. I mean, it's just celebrity worship, and they just worship him.
In reading your writing and the writing of others, I walk away with a perception, Nicki, that it's quite possible that it was common knowledge in elite entertainment circles as well as in comedy circles. When I was a kid, Bill Cosby was a comedian who was then breaking into television. In the early part of his career, he was a touring comedian who played clubs and went out and toured the country. As I understand it, as far back as the 1960s, he was known as a serial rapist, that this pattern of drugging women and raping them while they were unconscious may extend back, 50 years or more. Is that a fair perception?
I know it extended back at least into the 70s that people in Hollywood and people were aware of that. I'm not as certain about the 60s. That was the days of I Spy.
Right.
But he was certainly preying on women then. And it certainly became very people knew. I mean, even, Tamara Green talked about, was what, 1969, 1970, Dr. Amar, who was Cosby's friend, who was her friend, was like, don't be alone with him. Do not be in a room alone with him. So people close to him certainly knew that he was doing this. And they just, I don't know, maybe it was because it was the 60s and it was Quaaludes and they're just, I don't know. He had so much power once he went on I Spy, especially, which was around 1965, 66.
Yeah.
He just had so much power. That's how men like that get away with it. I remember when this broke again in 2014, and one of the Cosby survivors got a text from Quincy Jones, who said, I've been telling Bill for years to stop drugging women. It was like, well, at least Quincy tried to stop him, because everybody else, I listened to Joe Rogan and Bill Maher, I don't know, last year, the year before Rogan's podcast went to Spotify. And they were laughing about, oh yeah, I knew back in the 90s he was doing this. And I knew back in the 80s he was doing this, and blah, blah, blah. These modeling agencies knew. They were sending him victims. So many of these women were, and they were barely out of their teens. Some of them were teenagers. Most of them were barely out of their teens, like 20, 21, 22. And they just fed him victims. William Morris's agency knew because they were helping pay off the victims. It's interesting because I read the Cosby biography too that Mark Whitaker did that Cosby cooperated with. I read in there that in the early 70s, I think it was around then, Camille took over the money for Cosby because he had a manager that stole a lot of his money. And I'm thinking, all right, so how did Camille not know if she took over the money? Well, then I kind of learned how that industry works when you have a manager, because I had an agent, I've since gotten rid of, but I had an agent and the money would go to her first. So that's what it is. The money goes to the agency first, and then it goes to the performer. So I'm guessing that's how they were able to pay off these women without Camille knowing, because they took it out of whatever money came into the agency. It goes to the agency first, and then it goes to the entertainer.
When you reference Camille, you're referencing Camille Cosby, his wife, who he's still married to all these years later.
Yes, his wife, Camille.
So is it plausible at all that she didn't know?
Well, she packed up the kids and moved out of Beverly Hills to Western Massachusetts, where they still have this palatial estate. And I think in the early 70s. So, and he was traveling a lot and touring a lot. And so when he went to Chicago, he stayed at the Playboy Mansion in Chicago, or he stayed at the one in Beverly Hills with Hugh Hefner. So maybe she knew he was cheating on her, but I don't know if she's just still got blinders on. I told Laura Richards when I was on talking about Cosby, when she was talking about coercive control. I'd never thought of it in these terms, but Camille is like 6 years younger than Cosby, completely dependent on him financially for their entire marriage. Is he just in control of everything with her? She seems like a fierce, independent woman when you see her, but is she?
One of the things that I hadn't really thought about before I read the book, but once you mentioned it in the book, I couldn't stop thinking about it, is how many other people had to have been complicit in this, and not just the agents, but like his handlers, his assistants, the people who would even just get his car, or take his luggage to his room or whatever. There had to have been so many other people who knew about this, but were willing to stay quiet. And that's just unfathomable to me. Just the idea that there were so many people who knew this, and it was a whole conspiracy of silence.
Right. And if you look at PJ Maston, I mean, when she walked into that, like, she'd known Cosby for a few years through the Playboy world, because she was a Playboy bunny mom. When she went into his hotel room, they were going to go out to dinner. He invited her up first for a drink. There were 3 other people in that hotel room. I know who a couple of them are, and you would recognize those names, but she doesn't say it publicly for a reason. And then he says, would you like a drink? She says, sure. He says, what? She says, Grand Marnier. Well, why didn't he just go to the bar for a drink? No, he calls down to the bellman, sends the bellman out to get it. He brings it up. What did he really send the bellman out for? Right. And then they come up and they do. And then she wakes up 10 hours later and she's been raped. So she took 2 sips of that drink. Grand Marnier would not do that to you. And there were 3 other guys in there at the time when all this happened. So they knew something was up. There are so many enablers. And Stacey Pinkerton, who ended up meeting her at the sentencing, and she's in the epilogue, she met his driver, Cam, on the ride to the airport from her hotel. She's a flight attendant. And he's like, oh, do you want to meet Bill Cosby? So he procured, she served her up to him. And then again, oh, I'm going to mentor you. I'm going to help you. Do you want to be in a mall? Get your, go to New York. Nothing happens. They're safe. You gain that sense of security. But then as, Jim Clemente was very interesting when I was on Real Crime Profile, because we were talking about Therese Serenice, and that's the only one he admitted to giving Quaaludes to, but she was 19. That was an instantaneous thing. He saw her in the gift shop at the Las Vegas Hilton. She was there with her younger brothers and sisters. And he just walked up to her, put his arm around her, said, "Do you want to marry me?" And so he spotted her. He just instantaneously decided that and then invited her to the show and got her back there. That's what Jim pointed out. And I hadn't really thought about that. Like that was one of like, he read her immediately and he could tell this was someone he could do this to. And Teresa herself will say that, you know.
That's terrifying. So he had to have had these drugs with him almost always. Everywhere that he went, he must have been carrying that with him.
Yeah.
That's terrifying.
Well, Linda Trait's another victim, almost victim, actually. She's worked at Figaro's, which is where, and this is funny, they all corroborate each other without even knowing each other and without even knowing they corroborate each other. So she was a waitress at Figaro's, which was where Tamara Green said that he drugged her. He invited her, he was going to give her a ride home, he takes her to the beach, and he pulls out a briefcase filled with drugs. And he's like, "Do you want?" And so she manages to get away from him. And there's another woman, she was the only other victim who testified at the first trial, and she worked for his agent at William Morris. And she got fired after Cosby did this to her. But she says he was coaching her for acting, and he invites her to the Beverly Hills, might have been one of the big hotels there. They're supposed to have lunch, but then when she gets there, says, "Mr. Cosby wants you to go to the bungalow." She goes to the bungalow. He opens up the door. He's wearing his white robe. Then he says to her, "Here, take this." And she says, "I don't want to." He says, "Take it." Remember, he's the most important client at William Morris. He had his own private telephone line to her boss. That's how important he was. So she takes it and she puts it under her tongue. And he says, "Lift your tongue up." He knew she was trying to hide it under her tongue. So she swallows it and then she runs to the bathroom and she goes in there and there's prescription pill bottles everywhere.
Right.
So, yeah, I mean, he seemed to take it with him wherever he went.
You're listening to Mind Over Murder. We'll be right back after this word from our sponsors. We're back here at Mind Over Murder. This period between 2005 and 2014, talk to us about that. You're beyond an early adopter. You knew more about what was going on with Cosby as a journalist than I think probably anyone did. Yet the story doesn't really explode until 9 years later. What's happening for you as you're moving forward in trying to advance this story and get to the bottom of Cosby's criminal serial rapes across the country?
It's interesting because I was working for, as I said, the Philadelphia Daily News at the time. And I have said this over and over again in my interviews in the last few years, that there was no other news organization in the country that would have allowed me to pursue this story in 2005 the way the Daily News did. And I know that for a fact, because even when I was doing the podcast with the LA Times, and Herzog was great, but the LA Times, they were freaking out about, the podcast at the very last minute. And they wanted to take some of the women out. And I'm like, wait a second, he's convicted. And I said, you have written stories about every one of these women. Why are you worried? Now we had 16 survivors in the podcast. Well, because it's all in one place. I said, but you wrote this story about, and this is what I think Camille Bell used for his podcast. You wrote a story, the 50-year history of Cosby's career, juxtaposed with all the allegations against him. So you had them all in one story. And I sent it to them. Like, oh, yeah. So I think that everybody was scared of being sued. They were scared of losing access to him. Marty Singer, his attorney at the time, was calling me nearly every day, threatening to sue me. They were sending threatening letters to my newspaper, threatening to sue us. And my reporting caught the eye of People magazine, ironically. I say ironically because then they backed off the story too. But they came to me and wanted me to freelance for them because they were thinking about doing a cover story. My bosses were fine with me working for them as long as they got it first. So I started freelancing for them. And it was a really disillusioning experience for me. I was going on all these talk shows and I was getting beaten up by the co-hosts and everything. A negative story was written about me in the Philly Weekly, and they quoted these journalism experts as saying the cover story I did on Tamara Green shouldn't have been a cover story, that it's a he said, she said, that it's sensationalistic. I was just being ripped to shreds everywhere. And then the DA was threatening to have me arrested for my stories.
Wow.
So Bruce Castor, yes, he was telling people he could have me arrested for my stories. It was not like I was ever covered in glory in this. I mean, I don't think I've ever won. It's funny watching all these other people who come into the story 10 years later. Now they're winning Emmys and doing all this. And I'm like, not me, which is fine. That's obviously not why I did it. But it was really hard. So I ended up doing other stories for people. And then my newspaper once again went through another series of it was going to be layoffs or buyouts, and they wanted 25 people to leave my newsroom. I can barely do my job now. I was getting very burnt out and the workload was incredible. So I decided to take it because I could freelance for people. It was a very steady freelance work. So I took that. It was like a year's salary. And then I thought, well, I'll write that Cosby book. And then I quickly realized that book is never going to get published. Even the agents I was talking to were reluctant because it was a husband and wife team. The wife was a Cosby fan. I was like, you know what? Judging by what I just saw and all the pressure they put on my newspaper not to run these stories, I don't think this book would ever get published. And years later, in 2000, I didn't know, a couple of years earlier, Janice Dickinson had put in her memoir about Bill Cosby drugging and raping her. And Judith Regan had her take it out because she said it's not that we couldn't, because Cosby was known as being very litigious in the publishing industry. Mm-hmm. And she said it's not that we couldn't have won that lawsuit, but we would have spent millions fighting it. So I stopped covering it for people. I was working on a book proposal, and then I decided not to do the book, and people ended up putting me on staff. In the interim, all of a sudden, the story hadn't run at people like the one we've been working on. And then after Andrea settled her lawsuit, Andrea Constand filed a civil lawsuit against Cosby after the DA decided not to criminally charge him. In November 2006, she settled it. I went to my editors like, can we run this story now? You know, if these women are brave enough to have their names and photos be used, can't we be brave enough to run it? But they were still so worried about being sued by Cosby. But they ultimately ran it, but they did not put it on the cover. And they do a weekly press release where they tout all their exclusives, and it was not included there. So they did this very low-key media strategy. Because, of course, the other thing with celebrity magazines and news organizations in general is that the agency, like Bill Cosby's reps at William Morris, also represent all these other celebrities. So if you tick them off, then you could lose access to all these other people.
I was waiting for that word access, because that's what these magazines are all about.
Yeah. So, I packed up after that. I was like, okay, this story's over. Andrea can't talk. She signed an NDA with her lawsuit, but I just couldn't get rid of the files. I packed them all up in a waterproof box and I put them in my basement. And I thought, someday this may come back. Maybe there will be a new victim. I certainly didn't think it would be Andrea's case coming back. I thought that was over. But I was just like, I just can't get rid of all this. And then October 2014, Hannibal Buress, this young Black rising comedian, comes to Philly and does a routine and starts talking about Bill Cosby being a rapist in his routine. And there's a Philly Mag reporter in the audience who starts recording it on his iPhone. He writes a story about it the next day for phillymag.com with the video. And the next few days, it just exploded and went viral. And that's what brought it all to the forefront. The difference was there was no social media in 2005. My stories were going out in the Knight Ridder Wire, which was like a wire service back then. And that was driving Cosby's people crazy because when they called to yell at me, they were telling me that because it was popping up in places all over the country. So there was no social media in 2005. The only thing out there was Facebook, and it was just for college students. But when phillymag.com did a story in October 2014, it exploded on social media because there was a video too. So he did his story. Someone saw it on Facebook I sort of tracked this in the book because it was interesting to me. We didn't realize till I was doing the book how it all unfolded. The reporter put it on his Facebook page. Someone from, I think, BuzzFeed or Gawker saw it on Monday, and then they did something, and then someone else did something. And by the time Hannibal Buress shows up that Wednesday for his interview with Howard Stern, it's exploded. It's all over Twitter. It's everywhere. And that's what really, made this thing explode. And then Cosby's people tried to combat the social media stuff by doing a meme contest. And instead, people started making all these memes about Cosby drugging women. So they had to take it down the same day.
I loved reading about that. That was great.
And also, there were all these news organizations that were online news organizations like Gawker and so forth that didn't exist in 2005, really.
Right.
And BuzzFeed. And they were not afraid to take on Bill Cosby, where the mainstream media was still very reluctant to write anything. You should watch that Associated Press interview where he just basically tells them, it took them 2 weeks to release it in November 2014, where he basically is like, we're going to call so-and-so in LA. And he tells his handler, call them and let them know that you guys shouldn't use this. So you can see how much he controlled them in that. And that's what I was up against, too. I was reading all the stories when I was doing my book. I'm like, wow, the Associated Press back in 2005, which they did sort of make up for it later because they filed to unseal a motion in Andrea's lawsuit that had the deposition excerpts that led to this whole thing really exploding the following summer. But back then, they were his toady. I mean, their stories were very much pro-Cosby. And it was very disillusioning for me because I thought the media was kind of like who I worked for at the time. I didn't realize the media is supposed to not be able to be pressured by powerful people. We're supposed to take them on and not be afraid to take them down if need be. And it's just not that way anymore.
You talked about the concept of trading up when you talked about the National Enquirer and how Cosby would say, well, I'll give you an exclusive interview if you don't run this story. I'd heard of the phenomenon before, but I didn't realize how willingly so many members of the press just kind of jumped into it. We're like, yeah, okay, we will not run this story about absolutely heinous behavior in exchange for an exclusive interview with Cosby. There were times when I was reading your book that my jaw just dropped. I was like, I can't believe, except I sort of can, but I don't want to believe that the media would have behaved in this way.
It wasn't just the National Enquirer, it was ABC. The only story that ABC did about Cosby during that time period when the investigation was going on was one that said, it was from a source close to Cosby saying his and Andrea's stories line up, except that he says it was consensual and she says it wasn't. And then lo and behold, they get the first TV sit down with him a couple months later and they get access. What makes this even crazier, this is when he was going around the country, going into inner cities and lecturing Black people about how to behave.
Yes, I remember this
holding these
well.
Town halls, and you, as a journalist, you couldn't get in unless you were invited. And ABC got into it, and they got access. They did a Nightline segment on it. All of this, and that's how it started out with me with his handlers. First, it was, we got to get you into one of these town halls. First, they tried the carrot, and then they tried the stick. And when, that offer slowly went away as my stories got more aggressive. But that is how they started out. We got to get you into one of these town halls. And of course, journalists were champing at the bit to get into these town halls because it was, very controversial and everything that was going on at the time. One of the bookers for one of the TV shows I was on is the one who told me about trading up, because he said that they were getting a lot of pressure from Cosby's people not to have me on these shows talking about my stories. And pretty soon I wasn't on them anymore.
And it took a viral video of a stand-up comedian brave enough to do a routine about Cosby being a rapist 9 years after the fact in a changed media environment to break this story wide open, something that you'd been working on for a decade.
Yes. And it blackmail. I think that might have been important because Barbara Bowman, one of the victims we spoke to back, she was one of the original 12 Jane Does, and Andrea Constance civil sued one of the victims. And she had been in our People story in 2006. And she wrote an op-ed for the Washington Post. Like, why did it take a man for people to believe me?
Yeah. Isn't that sad? Yeah.
I know. And even look at this docuseries that Showtime just did. We have been trying to do one too, and nobody will do it. But now that a man wanted to do a docuseries, and I think race played it, because I think that Hollywood is still very reluctant to do anything attacking him, especially after George Floyd, that I don't think it's a coincidence that that's how that project went forward. It's just really sad.
Did they ever threaten you directly or indirectly during this time when you were kind of carrying this banner? You were right the entire time, and these women were telling the truth. Did they ever communicate with you directly or indirectly in any threatening way?
Back in 2005?
Yeah. In that time frame, you were working this story before anybody else was. And so you're kind of standing out there alone with these women who were his victims. How was it communicated to you, for example, when you didn't get bookings, television bookings that you were expecting to get? And how was that characterized?
Oh, honestly, I could have cared less about the TV bookings. I went on there to just, as I told Marty, like I told you, Marty Singer, Cosby's attorney, was calling me nearly every day, screaming at me and threatening me. And, so you were on TV again last night. It was making him crazy. I bet you really enjoyed that. And I'm like, oh yeah, Marty, I love working 12-hour days. And I live an hour from Philly, and then sticking around another couple hours to get 5 minutes on a show and then drive another hour home. And I don't get paid for it. Yeah, Marty, it's just a really, really fun. And I'm thinking, and getting yelled at by you every day.
Yeah.
And he was also sending threatening letters to my newspaper, threatening to sue us. And like I said, Bruce Castor, the DA, was telling other reporters he could have me arrested for my stories. No, it was very, very, very hard. But I believed in my reporting. I believed the women, so I didn't really care. But it was not fun. It's not fun.
Now that you've brought up Bruce Castor, let's go ahead and get into his role in Cosby's conviction being overturned, which I think sent shockwaves through everybody. What is the deal that he made that eventually led to Cosby's conviction being overturned? Can you explain that for our listeners?
Well, let me first say that there's no evidence that there was any such deal made.
Okay.
I am convinced it's something that he came up with 10 years later when the case exploded again. Back in 2005, in February, when Castor decided not to charge Cosby. Now, let me tell you first, Bruce Castor is a DA who always held a press conference at a drop of a hat for everything. And the only time he held a press conference during this was after they interviewed Cosby. And it was very much clear that he was not going to be charging Cosby from the tone of his comments, which is what brought forth Tamara Green, the second accuser, because she heard it and she's like, I used to work for a DA. That's DA speak for I'm not going to charge him. So when it came time to announce he was not going to charge him, he wrote a press release and released it. But what was unusual is that he wrote it himself. Mm-hmm. That was the only thing that was unusual, but it was still weird. But we got it. And he didn't tell Andrea's attorneys beforehand. Andrea didn't know. They were blindsided when the media just showed up. 10 years later, Bruce Castor, after this case explodes again in the media, and then after the DA, who was the current DA, who was his first assistant back in 2005, Risa Furman, she was Bruce Castor's first assistant back in 2005. So she reopens the case. Now, do you think she would have reopened that case if she had known there was a non-prosecution, been aware that Castor was saying there was a non-prosecution deal back in 2005?
Oh, hell no.
Why would she have reopened that case?
Yeah.
Right. But she was running for judge that same year. So she hasn't really never spoken publicly about this. So she reopens it. And then a month or two later, when it breaks the news, then all of a sudden Bruce Castor's saying, Brusa, don't you remember when I told you back in 2005 that we agreed never to prosecute Bill Cosby on this? And she's like, no, Bruce, I don't remember that. And you document everything. Where's the document? Mm-hmm. Well, the document was the press release.
Oh, please.
That doesn't make any sense.
No.
Right. And in Pennsylvania, I don't know other states, you have to have an agreement not to prosecute. It has to be a written agreement. It has to be signed off on by a judge. You don't have the power as a district attorney to make that offer yourself. But he didn't anyway. It's non-existent. So that's where that all came from. The trial judge held a very long hearing on this very issue. Bruce Castor testified for several hours. So did Andrea's attorneys testified. And the judge ended up finding him not credible and the one attorney of Cosby's who was still alive not credible. And that's where those issues are supposed to be dealt with at that level, because the Pennsylvania Supreme Court isn't sitting in a courtroom listening to all the evidence. You can't determine credibility through paper. Only the trial judge can do that. So basically, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court overstepped with that decision. I wrote a long piece on it on my Substack about how there's a lot of things. The one thing I can tell you about the decision, it was not based on the law. I don't know what kind of deal was cut. I don't know something, but there was some kind of deal cut because that decision was not based on the law.
There was that very weird quote from Bruce Castor where he said he was the sovereign minister of justice, I think it was.
The sovereign. Yes, I sat in that hearing and we were all just going, are you kidding me? Yes. He said that he, as the sovereign of Montgomery County, he had the power to make this deal.
Yeah, I remember thinking how ludicrous this was.
Yes. And that's why he was found not credible, because the judge was just, and that's why he was found not credible. The judge did not believe him. And he also said that he told Risa to tell Andrea's attorney, he said that Andrea's attorneys had signed off on it. And they got on the stand and said, no, we didn't. We did not sign off on this. Honestly, I was surprised he didn't get charged with perjury.
Oh, jeez.
So in the end, how is it that Cosby's conviction was overturned and he was released from prison? I mean, how does that happen?
I wish I could tell you, but all I can tell you, I don't know what happened with the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. I watched the oral arguments hearing, and at one point, one of the justices actually walked away and shut their camera off for 10 minutes after they asked one of the Montgomery County prosecutors a question. And the tone was so hostile, and they're all pretty old. I said, one thing I'm thinking is, they're all Bill Cosby fans. Like, they're all fans of the Cosby Show because they're in that age group.
Yeah,
or maybe even further back to like his albums and stuff, because there was zero that was not based on the law. They overstepped. They really overstepped with that decision. And the only way to undo it would be to go to the U.S. Supreme Court, and they declined to hear it. I mean, and I understand that it's got to be an issue that applies to other cases. And this is just one that is so, well, again, it's not based on the law. So I don't know why they did it, but there is someday, I swear to God, I will find out, because it was not based on the law. There was some kind of sweetheart deal cut. I don't know what it was, but that's what happened.
We do know here that in the late part of June, he was convicted for drugging and assaulting Judy Huth back in 1975. So what is that going to mean for him? Is that going to get him back to prison?
No, that was a civil lawsuit. So, yeah. So he has to pay her $500,000, but he is also going to appeal that. But that's the thing with Cosby. Every time he lost, I think he was up to lawyers 24 and 25. By the time we got to the Pennsylvania Supreme Court appeals, because every time he'd lose a round, he would fire them and get new ones. He still owes money to some of his previous attorneys, or he did at one point. There's another, Lily Bernard, another Cosby survivor, just filed a lawsuit against him back in October, because what's happening is there are several states that have passed what they call look-back laws, which give sexual abuse victims, some, like the one in New Jersey was for sexual abuse victims. It gave them like a 1 or 2 year window to file a lawsuit against their attackers, no matter how long ago it was.
Right.
So that's how Lily was able, hers was like in the 90s, and that's how Lily was able to file it in New Jersey just last October. Now, what's interesting is New York just passed look-back law for a year. So stay tuned. I have a feeling there's going to be some more filed against Cosby based on that law being passed, but they're civil lawsuits.
They are
Sadly,
civil, not criminal.
What some of the Cosby survivors did after the case broke again in 2014 is they got the statute of limitations laws extended or eliminated for criminal cases. It got eliminated in California. It got extended in Nevada, and it got extended in Colorado. They did that, and it didn't benefit them. It was not retroactive, but at least it's done. If he's done anything more recently, there's possibilities that he, if victims come forward, but why would they? Why would they? Look at what just happened. Look at how poor Andrea was dragged through the mud. I mean, I write about this in the book. First of all, I think predators usually choose victims they think won't be believed. They choose them from, unequal power status or lower income level or just or a vulnerability. But then Tamara Green, every bad thing she had ever done since it happened got leaked to the media, and the media ran with it. And I said, one of the experts I spoke with said that's why rape shield laws were created, to protect this from happening in court. What happens now is defense attorneys just go to the media. And I said, the ironic part, though, so you have to be the perfect victim to be able to be believed. The ironic part is Andrea Constand was that perfect victim. She had no skeletons in her closet. So the Cosby team made up lies about her in 2005, and the media ran with it. They ended up running her name and photo without her permission, which does not happen with sexual abuse victims. So there's a double standard. And that's what's so sad in the media today. They will rake someone like Andrea Constand over the coals because they know she doesn't have the means to sue them, but they will not take on someone like Bill Cosby because they're terrified of being sued.
This was a rough book to read, Nicki. It really was. It's beautifully written. I enjoyed reading it because it gave me a lot more insight into Cosby and his crimes. But it was a rough read. It made me infuriated reading these awful attacks on Andrea and all the other women and how Cosby's lawyers raked them over the coals. This could not have been easy for you to live with. How did you live with this? From 2005 till now, how do you have the emotional fortitude to deal with this? I don't think that I could have.
Well, I think it was somewhat easier in 2014 when all the other media suddenly jumped on the bandwagon and I wasn't alone anymore. Mm-hmm. But that brought its own set of problems. It was funny, actually, just so typical of the media, because, of course, there were other journalists out there touting, like, I tried to warn people about Cosby back in 2007. I'm like, you didn't. I mean, or if you did, so what? I did all this in 2005. I mean, there was the Philly Mag reporter, another Philly Mag reporter, Bob Huber, who wrote a story where he actually got into one of Cosby's town halls. So actually he took that carrot at first, but then included stuff about the victims. But he lifted from my daily news stories for his Philly Mag story and didn't attribute it. And then they ended up having to run a correction about it after I kind of raised hell about it. I'm sorry for my language. In a way, I was glad to see that the victims were being treated so well. But then the other media come in and now then they start winning awards for their coverage. They won Emmys, and it's just, you just have to laugh at some point. It's so like, yeah, not my story. But I was glad that it was getting the attention it deserved. It was because that's what I thought would happen in 2005. And I'd seen it happen with other stories. There would be these eye broke some stories and all the other media would join it. It'd become this big thing. It would put pressure on the DA to do something. And, so I was glad to see it happening a decade later. It led more and more victims to come forward, and they kept the pressure on. And then the AP came in and they filed a motion to get, and I actually did talk to people like, hey, let's file a motion to see if we can get those documents unsealed now. They weren't interested. It's not how People magazine operates. So, because that's what we would have done if I was at the Daily News. We would have been going to court to get the same thing the Associated Press did. So I'm glad that they did that, because that's what blew this open even more and reopened Andrea's case, was because there were his own admissions about doing this to women, or at least about giving drugs to women he wanted to have sex with.
I'm glad you can see the positive. In other words, that media pile-on, it probably did have some benefit, even though you had to say to yourself, where have you guys been for the last 9 years?
Well, and then all these stories are breaking in October 2014, I'm like, it's like deja vu all over again. I reported all of this 10 years ago and nobody cared. And now it's like, oh my God, It was surreal. It was surreal. But again, for their sake, I was glad that they were finally being heard.
What's next for you now?
I am working on a few different projects. I have some book writing projects I'm doing. And so just nothing I can really talk about, but I haven't given up on investigating.
So will this be in the true crime genre or elsewhere?
Both. I've got a couple of different things going, and I'm developing some podcasts too. So trying to just a lot of, I work for an agency where I write books for an agency. And there's another one I've been working on a proposal for that is true crime. That's very explosive, but it just needs more work. It needs more investigating before I'll put my name on it. But it's another explosive one. It's another one where there's the good cops who are doing their best to get the truth out. And then there are the bad, and it's again with the coroners and the medical examiners ruling these as undetermined, which essentially means nothing gets done. And these are murders. So,
okay.
Yeah.
Wow. So lots more to look forward to from you in the coming months and years.
So the book is called Chasing Cosby, The Downfall of America's Dad. Where can we find it?
Wherever you buy books, your local bookstore, you can ask for it, Amazon, it's available wherever you buy books.
Excellent. And then your other book, which we have talked about previous to this on the podcast, is Victim F. And that was with Aaron Quinn and Denise Huskins, correct?
Yes, I co-authored with them. Yes.
That one was... That was crazy. I literally sat and read it for 5 straight hours, did not move, did not put it down, just like sat there and read it in one fell swoop. It is amazing. We would love to have you back on the pod to talk about that one if you're willing.
Oh, of course. I'd love to.
I think that's where the phrase unputdownable comes from.
Totally.
I know.
Was.
I mean, it's like one of these things you're like, truth is stranger than fiction. The more, especially knowing Aaron and Denise and the type of people they are and what incredible, extraordinary people they are, that this happened to them is just mind-boggling. It really gives you pause about what chance does the average person have with the police in a situation like this if it can happen to them.
Yeah. It's the most amazing, mind-boggling story. And we'd love to have you back to talk about it.
Okay, I'd love to do it.
Well, that's going to do it for this episode of Mind Over Murder with Nicki Egan. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll see you next time.
Mind Over Murder is a production of Absolute Zero and Another Dog Productions.
Our executive producers are Bill Thomas and Kristin Dilley.
Our logo art is by Pamela Arnois.
Our theme music is by Kevin MacLeod.
Mind Over Murder is distributed in partnership with Crawl Space Media.
You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram.
You can also follow our page on the Colonial Parkway Murders on Facebook.
And finally, you can follow Bill Thomas on Twitter at BillThomas56.
Thank you for listening to Mind Over Murder.